بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صباح الخير جميعا. Good morning everyone. I hope you had a good evening last night, so fresh for the second day of this extraordinary event organized by ERF. This session under the title SDG Stimulus to deliver Agenda 2030 is quite challenging given the current position in the Arab region with the unprecedented events that are adding to the difficulties of the region and the challenges that we are facing. So it's putting another burden on achieving the SDG targets and as committed for 2030. We have, that's why I think the organizers, Excellency Mahmoud al-Badawi has put the right panel except myself. So we have Mr. Lee Junho, the Under Secretary General of the United Nations, who will join us by video recording. We have Ms. Roberta Gatti. Thanks for coming. We have Mr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, who will join us online. I hope he is connected. And we have Sarah Hassania, Excellency, great to see you. And we have Haba Handousa. Ah, why don't you join us here? Great, great. Thank you, Ms. Heba. And we have Dr. Tuhami, great to see you as well. So, without delay, we will start by the Under Secretary General.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the organizers for inviting me to address the 30th Annual Conference of the Economic Research Forum. Unfortunately, I'm unable to join you there in person. You will be discussing a critical issue of our time: how to enable sustainable development in your region in a time of the rising systemic risks, conflicts, and waning trust in multilateralism. Our focus is on accelerating progress on SDGs and preventing further setbacks from crisis. For example, the challenges encountered in development financing include an investment crisis driven by a sluggish global economy and tight financial conditions. These have been a key stumbling block to SDG progress. The international financial architecture, crafted 80 years ago, has not kept pace with the scale and the complexity of today's challenges. It is no longer fit for the purpose in a world characterized by rapidly changing economic geography, integrated financial markets, increasing systemic risks, and a growing climate emergency. The UN Secretary General has been very vocal on the need for the rapidly scaling up financing through the SDG Stimulus and for the ambitious reforms to the international financial architecture. The SDG Stimulus is a comprehensive action plan to mobilize at least $500 billion annually to accelerate the SDG progress, primarily through the MDBs. There has been some important progress. For instance, the African Development Bank has emerged as a leader in using innovative approaches to stretch its lending capacity. But the stimulus alone will not be enough. We also need architectural reform, starting with a more inclusive global economic governance. Governance reforms can also pave the way for other reforms, for closing gaps in the debt architecture, for strengthening the financial safety net, and for a fairer and more inclusive international tax architecture. Excellencies, dear colleagues, making tangible and meaningful progress on global financing challenges can provide a much-needed boost to multilateralism. In this regard, last December, the General Assembly of the United Nations established an ad hoc committee to develop the draft terms of the reference for a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation by August 2024. In June next year, Spain will host the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, a follow-up to the Monterrey Consensus and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Member states have called on this conference to address the reform of the international financial architecture. It will provide a key opportunity for the international community to adopt an ambitious package of the reform. We do have the high expectations on this conference. Therefore, I count on your engagement to bring the critical perspectives, experiences, and the recommendations from your region to these global processes. Only with a truly inclusive and transparent process can we achieve ambitious and fruitful outcomes that can bring the transformative changes. I thank you.
Thank you. So without further, this sets the scene really for the discussions from the agenda and the actions taken by at the UN at the highest level. Now I'll pass on the floor to Ms. Roberta Gatti.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and let me just start by thanking Dr. Ibrahim, Dr. Shireen, and ERF for the invitation today. And I will have a presentation. I was asked to speak about this enormous agenda of SDGs, so I had to make choices. In these choices, as you can see here, you're probably all familiar with the image of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were, yes, and then I'll put myself here, which were adopted in the wake of the Millennium Development Goals in 2015 at the Sustainable Development Conference. And I think that my understanding of that process was really that the idea of ending deprivation and poverty really had to come together with a broader agenda of investing in people and making sense of an environment which now is, I think, reflected also very fully in the mandate of the World Bank of a world free of poverty on a sustainable planet. Now, these are 17 goals, and we could really spend days discussing them. So I had to make choices here for my 10 minutes. And I made my choices based on a recent interview that I had in a couple of days back, and somebody asked me, so where do you think the growth is going to come from in MENA? And I said, it's going to come from two things, and that these are my views, and I'll be happy to hear yours later. And I said, one, they will come from freeing up the potential of productivity by structural reforms that really realign the role of the private sector and the state. And second, and that's not in an order of importance, but it comes together, it will come from its people. And I think that this is a region that has an enormous wealth, which is not oil. Well, it is also oil, but it's really its people. It's young people that can really deliver what we often talk about as the demographic dividend. So I decided to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals that have to do with people and just have a sense, more diagnostic than sort of big picture of where is the region is at. And if I have time, I will just put out a couple of challenges that I see for us connected to the Sustainable Development Goals, but also for the region. So here we go. Among the 17, I'll focus on health and well-being, gender equality, if I have time, on quality of education, all of which are part of sort of developing healthily and productively as an individual, and then I'll talk a bit about a couple of challenges. So, health and well-being. In each of the Sustainable Development Goals, there are a range of sub-goals that really try to make sense of the big picture. In this case, it's really ensuring healthy lives across the life cycle. So let's start at the beginning of that life cycle, and that's from motherhood and health in childhood. So it turns out that our region performs quite well on maternal and neonatal mortality, but countries could do much better on under 5 mortality. So let's look at the left, and this is maternal mortality rate. It's a very painful, I think, goal to think about because it's the deaths per 100,000 live births. Our region does relatively better than the world average, and you see the world average in red on the left-hand side, and you see it depicted on the right-hand side. However, something that I think is very true for our region, and you see it in these graphs, and I'm sure that you all know about it, is the tremendous heterogeneity that comprises the MENA region. And here I need to be honest, I will speak about the MENA region as how it is understood in the World Bank, from Morocco to Lebanon, including Djibouti, but excluding countries such as Turkey, which is instead included in the UN definition. So we're doing quite well on maternal mortality, and we know that that's a very hard indicator to move. There's been a tremendous improvement at the beginning of the 2000s, but then improvement slowed down dramatically after 2015. However, in Yemen, we still see 183 deaths per 100,000 live births compared to the mortality, the average mortality rate of 70. When we think about children, again, another painful reminder that there are countries in the world where 13% of children do not make it to their 5th birthday. What we see here is that the MENA average mortality rate of children is close to the SDG goal of 25. There is high heterogeneity, and we find that a number of countries are above the target value, and particularly in Yemen, and a little less so in Iraq, Algeria, and Syria, mortality could be reduced. Just one nugget of information, half of this mortality happens by the first 28 days of life of a child. And the very painful fact, but also the hopeful one, is that this is due to preventable causes, the majority of which have to do with pneumonia, neonatal asphyxia, and conditions that can really be avoided and deaths averted due to better prenatal and neonatal care. If we move forward on the sort of life cycle, let's think about adolescent birth rate. And you'll see why we decided among all of the different indicators to put this one up when we talk about gender. So the MENA region, on average, does really quite well. It falls in the middle. And for somebody who's worked on this region, you will have noticed that when we take MENA averages, we always fall in the middle because we kind of average out countries like, indicators in countries such as Yemen, or in this case, Iraq, with countries that are very rich. And so you always end up in the middle just because of the construct of how heterogeneous our region is. So when we think about this heterogeneity, we can see that actually in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Egypt, the percentage of girls who are married, of young women who are married by the age of 20 and 24 has been married before the age of 18. So why do we worry about this type of indicator? Because the relationship between age of age of childbearing and outcomes in terms of child health is not linear. It turns out that children are much more likely to be preterm, low birth weight, or have health conditions later if they are born to very young mothers. In the bigger picture, we know that early marriage before age 18 is associated with disempowerment and lack of agency for women. And that's something that we're going to see when we talk about gender equality, which I think is one of the areas where our region can make the best progress and also acquire the highest productivity in probably all the areas where to work on. Something that I wanted to put out there, just as a reminder, is that thinking about diseases now, and something that sort of moves us further in the sort of life cycle, our region has somehow made the transition from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases. This is what you see typically when you move from low income to middle income. However, we are in a situation where non-communicable diseases are impacting mortality significantly in our region. You see us there on the left-hand side, Northern Africa and Western Asia. This is the classification of the UN. So you'll see Sudan being included, but also Turkey, for example, being included. So the averages are kind of a bit skewed vis-a-vis what I would see as an average for the Middle East and North Africa. But just a couple of points to note here. There has been improvement since 2010, and then this is an improvement that has a rate quite similar to what we see around the world. Great. However, when we look at the mortality across the countries, personally, I think I was struck because this mortality is quite high, and we don't see a very clear income gradient in these rates of mortality. Typically, you see that things get better as countries get richer. But this is not the case. So this is a case where somehow we got richer, and I'm thinking about the GCC countries before getting healthier. So the rates of obesity, the rates of cardiovascular diseases are quite high, even in very rich country, and they're extraordinarily high, I would say, in a country like Egypt, in a country like Yemen, unfortunately, but also in Morocco and in Iraq. And when we see high rates of non-communicable diseases, we think of two things. The first one is that we need to have better prevention and better primary care. The second one is that we need to avert these deaths. We can avert these deaths with sort of better urgent care. The first one, I think, is the one where the biggest bang for the buck can be achieved in the region. And this is part of a large agenda of reform of the health systems that will make it less fragmented, more accessible, more affordable, but also would increase information and awareness across the population about lifestyle. Don't get me started here, because otherwise Dr. Shirin will go like, this is time to end it. But this is something that I think is very important, because it really cuts at the core of livelihood and healthy lives in the region. Now, let me just move to gender equality, because I know that my time is limited. But I wanted you to remember what we said about high adolescent birth rate and connect it to chances of the percentage of child marriages. Here the idea is that...
you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So, I'll try to be good. I thought
I was generous.
I will do my best to be succinct.
Yeah, okay.
So I just wanted to connect the idea of child marriage, which is an indicator of women's empowerment, with what we saw as an indicator of healthy motherhood and healthy childhood, which was being born to a mother who's above 18. So it turns out that child marriage before age 18 in MENA is still quite prevalent. Look at what is happening in Yemen. So 30% of married women between the age of 20 and 24 are married before age of 18. And almost 30% of those young women are married before the age of 18 in Iraq. So this is an indicator of still a potential for improvement in women's empowerment. Another one, and I won't go into the detail, is the female political representation. We went for something that might affect women potentially in the lowest socioeconomic strata to something that is probably an indicator of what happens to women in the upper economic strata. And yet, we are at one of the lowest shares of female political representation in the world. Let me put a parenthesis here, a quick one, and not think about the Sustainable Development Goals, but think about Women, Business and the Law, which is a product that is put out every year by the World Bank. So what turns out there is that the MENA region is at the bottom of all the indicators. However, the hope is on the fact that the rate of change has been high. And so a country like Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, has made a tremendous improvement in these indicators. But yet, what I wanted to point out is that it's a long road before we get there as a region. And this other slide, which has to do with non-discriminatory legal frameworks, also tells us the same story. And you see us in green at the bottom of that ranking. Now, I will skip on quality of education, although I think this is a very important one, and one where we also have to tell an interesting story, and I will go straight to the challenges, just because, you know, you always want to conclude with how you can do better, right? So, one thing that you will have noticed is that I didn't speak about policies that are needed, and I just stopped at where is the diagnostics and how we compare with the rest of the world. But I just wanted to put out there some challenges for us for reflection. So there is something about the Sustainable Development Goal, which was also shared with the Millennium Development Goals, is that they talk about averages. And as economists or as people who have worked in the region, we all know that what is most difficult is to elevate and improve what is happening to the lowest socioeconomic strata of the population. What you see here is a representation that, you know, I didn't make this up. So these are data from the Human Capital Index, which is an initiative that was very close to my heart and on which I spent actually 2 years of my life putting together. And the Human Capital Index is a way to translate human capital measures into what they mean in terms of productivity. Happy to answer questions about that later if you're interested. But what you see here on the left-hand side is that when we calculate the Human Capital Index for different socioeconomics groups, we find that there are significant differences between the bottom of the population in terms of a measure of wealth and the top. And you see those differences in the height of those bars that you see on the left-hand side. And we had data only for Egypt, Jordan, and the West Bank and Gaza that could be disaggregated. And you see that families at the top of the distribution do significantly better, and this is a measure of human capital related productivity, than families at the bottom. And you see something to the same effect on the right-hand side for the disaggregated indicators that enter the Human Capital Index. So this challenge is essentially a word of warning. We think about averages, but really the tough job is really to sort of elevate and invest on those who are the most disadvantaged. The second one is still to do with disaggregation. And here is where I would like to bring gender and sort of cross the idea of gender with the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. And for once, I would like not to be a Cassandra, but say something actually positive. And this is something positive that is happening to our region. I consider myself adopted by this region. What is happening is that young girls are doing much better than boys in school. And they're doing so in terms of attainment, so in terms of enrollment, and they're doing so in terms of results in literacy and math. So this tells me two things. One, there is hope. Two, when we look at the next graph and we look at female labor force participation, there is a lot of potential there that is unused. And I will never tire to say something like that. If we think about female labor force participation in our region, there is a reservoir of potential and productivity that is money left on the table. And I'm just focusing on the productivity side and not on the sort of moral imperative that comes with the idea of empowerment and agency of women. But that is money left on the table. I want to conclude with something that is also dear to my heart. I think that there's something very important in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is measurement. And you manage what you measure. And if you don't measure, it's very difficult to figure out where you want to get to, where you are, and what it takes to get to where you want to get to. So our region scores particularly poorly worldwide in terms of accountability. And my colleague Oda Sem, who might be here in the audience, has written a beautiful paper that really brings this idea together. Why am I talking about accountability? Because accountability goes together with lack of measurement. And lack of measurement in our region doesn't only mean we don't have the capacity to produce good data. On the contrary, the more I talk to statistical offices, the more I go around the world, the more I do this sort of very basic sort of stock-taking exercises, I realize that the data are there. But what is missing is openness to use those data. And yesterday, Dr. Ibrahim was asking a very important question: what can ERF do in this landscape? And I think that what ERF has done beautifully is really to put itself out there and highlight the importance of data, curate the quality of data, and make it available to academics. So I want to conclude with two thoughts. One, I focused on people because at the moment there is a tragedy that is happening in our region where people are suffering dramatically. And I wanted to highlight the potential that people have in our region. The second one, which is much more modest, is that ERF and together as a community of academics, we have an important role in really trying to push the agenda of data openness for a better understanding of the economics around us and a better realizing the incredible potential of MENA. So thank you, Your Excellency, for allowing me a few more minutes, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. It worth the exception. Now, after this excellent presentation, we leave the floor to Excellency Mr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin. He's online.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair. Good morning from New York at 4:37 a.m. I'm guided by a presentation building on what Mr. Lee from the UN and Roberta from the World Bank had shared with us. Let me say at the beginning that I'm very grateful to the invitation, and I'm missing being in Morocco. I can just share as well on the substance of the discussion that our region is not on track to achieve the SDGs. And the issue of the SDGs is a story of growth that is very much subdued. It's a story of investment in human capital, advanced infrastructure, and resilience, which leaves a lot to be desired. It's a story of funding from public, private, domestic, and external finance, which is witnessing a great deal of gaps. And this is basically the summary. If I'm missing anything, can just refer to what I just mentioned now. Next, please. So globally, only 15% of the countries are on track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. 48% are either significantly or slightly off track. And 37% of the countries are worse than where we were back in 2015. Next. And if you see the gap, it is realized here that we had a gap back in 2015 as observed and projected gaps in SDG indices. And there is a difference between high-income countries and low-income countries. The gap had widened significantly if you see the projected gap by 2030. You can always be comfortable if you are in a policymaker, if you are a policymaker trying to escape realities that there have been some external shocks, but actually before the external shocks of this decade, there have been big concerns about many countries not being on track even before the shocks of pandemics and war. After the shocks, we are even further away from achieving the SDGs. Next, please. And as you can see here from the SDG index by the United Nations and by the SDSN work led by Jeff Sachs and his colleagues, that we are deviating from the trajectory. Next, please. And but before that, if you can go back, and we can see actually that there are some critical indicators of SDGs, including the ones related to human capital mentioned by Roberta on education and health. They are not doing very well at all. Poverty and inequality had deteriorated on average in climate and biodiversity. Next, please. And again, this is another way on emphasizing the issues of being away from the trajectory if we are focusing on SDG 1, and globally we are not likely to achieve zero poverty by the measure developed by the World Bank of $15 a day. And with the current pace, we are more likely to see 7% of people of the world suffering from severity of extreme poverty. Next, please. This you can consider it as a kind of an eye test from a distance. These are the regions of the world. You can see our region that belongs to the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, some countries of our region belong to other sub-regions, but you can see here that there are more red than green and more downward arrows than upward ones. Next, please. And this is based on the SDSN assessment, and you can see even the best performing of the ERF region is not doing better than the global average. And you can see we are in Morocco here. You can see that Morocco is not doing bad compared to the rest of the region at almost 71% if you take the overall score of the SDGs. But I'm happy to come back to the issues related to based on indices in measuring SDG scores. Next, please. Yeah, and this is about finance. You remember again, I mentioned that SDGs performance is subject to our performance in inclusive growth. inclusive growth needs investments in quality and quantity in investment in human capital, infrastructure, and sustainability. In order to have investment, you need to have adequate funding based on the finance for development approach. You need public, private, domestic, and external finance. And here, welcome to the world of huge discrepancy, because here, based on the estimate of the OECD, there is a gap of around 3.9 trillion. UN Finance for Development, it tells us that there is a gap of $4 trillion. And then there is the high-level experts group that was commissioned by Egypt to assess the gap of finance for climate and for the SDGs at large. And the UAE supported the work in COP28. And they are identifying $5.4 trillion of a gap, of which there is $2.4 trillion needed for climate alone. Why the discrepancy? Because all of these estimates are based on assessments from the global perspective, and they are not necessarily relying on a bottom-up approach. And this could be one of the recommendations that we could be ending with. Next, please. And here you can really see the reversal of output growth, and it's good that Roberta mentioned in the case of our region where exactly the growth could be coming from productivity, from the non-oil sector, but that requires a huge and a leap in the way that we are tackling the non-oil sector, with higher productivity to be emphasized, but that requires better investments in human capital and better openness of the system and more efficiency in what we are doing. But there is a great deal of reversal, and our region is not an exception of that. Next, please. Here there are just a couple of indicators that we are not in the 2000s, we are not in the 2010s, we are not in the generous assumptions about the role of some typical financiers of development. And we can see even for low-income countries that the role of some traditional contributors to finance, including the multilateral development banks, and the contribution of the members of the Paris Club, either stagnant or shrinking. There is a bigger role now for private sector finance, and we see that when we are trying to solve problems, because unfortunately, finance for development, including finance for sustainable development at large and climate, is very much dependent on debt instruments. And here that tells us something about how we are better prepared for this new world and how we are ready if there is anything going wrong in the debt-based funding, which is really dangerous and risky. Are we prepared to deal with the crises or not? And actually what we have seen during the last 4 years, that the world is not ready, and we are not ready with instruments to deal better with liquidity management. And if there is a problem of debt, we are stuck. Next, please. And I'm taking here another example of two countries that are leading the developing economies and emerging world. And this is based on the World Bank international debt. You can really see now the structure of a country like India to the left or China to the right, from where the funding for development is coming from. And you can really see bigger role for commercial finance and bondholders. And then you can see that shrinking role of MDBs and concessional finance. Next, please. And I would say for the middle income countries of our region, you are going to be seeing something very similar to this. But too much dependence on debt rather than private equity participation and long-term finance is pushing the low-income, low middle income and upper middle income countries, but more on the middle income and lower income countries to see their external debt service to revenue is on the increase during the last 4 years. Next, please. And if you followed the spring meetings, I mean, you'll be seeing many, many reports discussing this worrying part that many countries around the world today are spending on debt service more than what they are spending on health or education or essential public investment. And if the ratio was worrying back in the period of 2010-2012, you can see to the right hand of that chart that you'll be seeing, including of countries in our region, that the number of countries spending more on debt service than what they spend on health, education, and public investment are really increasingly in a way that gets us very concerned. Next, please. Part of the problem of falling on debt, too much dependence on debt, especially if it is on hard currency, but at the same time, there is an issue of dealing with matters before they get into the debt crisis. And many countries today, including countries in our region, could have done better if they had a system of better debt management based on liquidity management before falling into insolvency challenges. Next, please. And again, referring to this issue on the increasing debt service in the MENA region, you can see from the World Bank International Debt Report, the increasing reliance on debt. And you have here to the right the countries by ratio on who's borrowing higher. You get Kuwait and at the lowest dependent on debt, but you can get the top 5 countries: Lebanon, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia are too much relying on external debt as a source of finance. Next, please. One point in this chart that you can really see the excessive debt financing, 7 times more loans than grants between 2010 and 2020, despite some improvements in domestic resource mobilization in some countries. Private sector finance is still very much limited, and only 4% of finance is sourced from global climate funds in the Arab region. So the mix of finance for development and climate needs to have a drastic revision. Next, please. Here there is something about the contingency financing. If we're not doing well in mitigation, in adaptation, and the SDGs, you'll be relying more in contingency finance. And here I'm just putting an example of contingency finance in the form of the loss and damage fund. Happy to come back to that if there is a question. Next, please. Yeah. So if I'm taking this example that I mentioned at the beginning of the gaps, and we have here the funding for the SDGs at large to be around, the need is around $5.4 trillion. If we focus on climate finance, it's 2.4. The assumption by the authors of that report, led by Vera Songoy and Extern, that 1.4 of finance will be coming from domestic resource mobilization. Good luck if your country is in deep trouble with debt repayment. And then $1 trillion, and this is for developing economies excluding China, $1 trillion is required to be coming from 3 sources: 4 times or quadrupling finance from private sector, tripling finance from the MDBs, and doubling finance from the bilateral sources. My concern is that none of that is materializing. I'm not seeing private sector coming in that kind of huge flows assumed in the report. The MDBs, including the World Bank and the African Development Bank, are very much constrained in their capital, and they cannot really be doing more than what they can. And some countries in our region their envelope of finance today is much less than what it used to be 10 years ago. Private sector finance is not flowing, and there is a very interesting piece by Larry Summers and Singh worrying us that we are today in a world of net negative capital flows. $70 billion dollars have been collected by the private sector in interest and principal 40 billion had been collected by international financial institutions. Net concessional assistance from international finance institution was only $2 billion, and I'm quoting from their study. Net negative capital flows is very much the opposite of the expectations of this important report by Nixon and Verasongwe. Next, please. What we need to do is basically to integrate the SDGs into policymaking, from strategies to planning to monitoring to government coordination, and not to consider SDGs finance as an afterthought. I'm not aware of a single country of our region that has a budget that is SDG based. Yes, there are strategies, there are these interesting visions 2030, but when it comes to integrating SDGs into budgeting, I think we need to do a better job in the remaining 5 years before the finish line. Next, please. Yes, Roberta, for good reasons, mentioned the issue of better data. There have been some slight improvement by the disappearance of Tier 3. Tier 3 on the data system means that there is no methodology and there is no data. Tier 2 means that there is a methodology but there is data. Tier 1 means that there is adequate methodology and there is data. And this is basically the global performance. But if you go to the right of this chart, you will be seeing that critical indicators, including for poverty, for inequality, you can see here that the performance of availing data for monitoring and for decision making, again, no country, the global system is telling us that there is a huge gap still. Next, please. Okay, and here, how these gaps on finance, again, how are they going to be bridged? I mentioned that there are lots of good assumptions, either by the IMF or by the experts group, that we need to do more in attracting investments, especially in infrastructure related to climate, as an example, or infrastructure at large. But again, the gaps are widening and we're seeing less and less funding. And there are some policies adopted by some advanced economies, like the IRA, good for the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, and some green investments of the EU, fantastic for these countries that they can really be doing better, but they have significant spillover effects. So private capital, again, is not really flowing because that is more attractive now to invest in the US or to invest in Europe, not necessarily in developing economies of the global South. Next, please. There are opportunities in the SDGs at large, including climate, especially that the cost effectiveness of some of the projects that are very much demanding for funding had been, thanks to technologies and R&D, had improved. But again, we need funding in order to realize the good gains of cost effectiveness. I'm happy that we are hosted in a country that has today one of the biggest solar plants in our region and in the world as well. In Ouarzazate, Egypt has its own project as well in Benban. Both countries, for example, have ambitious plans for green investments in energy, which is responsible for a great portion of required funding. But again, the rest of the region need to do more. Of course, the GCC countries who can afford doing more in this area are doing what they can, but the rest of the countries in the region need to take matters more seriously when it comes to funding on the non-hydrocarbon sector. They can take an advantage of the technologies, but again, we need better stream of funding, less dependent on debt. Next, please. There are investment opportunities, as I was trying to say, in solar power, in wind farms, and I'm happy that one of our countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, had proven to have one of the lowest costs of production of energy from solar sources. Next, please. Yes. So with this kind of a picture of the global landscape, what we can really be doing, I think it's a call for regional collaboration. And here, this is just an example of two things. First, for those who may tell you that there are no opportunities in our countries for having bankable or investable pipeline of projects, please inform them that they are wrong. There is a good list of projects ready for engagements to bank them or to invest in them. And this is just an example that I co-led with the with an impact on the SDGs. I see the chair perhaps want to tell me that. Okay, I wrap up in a minute. Thank you. And here you can really see the opportunities in regional cooperation and taking a kind of a regional perspective. The second part of the suggestion, next please, beyond regionalization, you can go local. And in localization, there is another initiative that was very much behind back home in Egypt about having another pipeline of bankable investable projects in 6 categories of investments that could really benefit from that other dimension. Normally, we talk global or at the national level, but what I'm trying to tell you that regionalization and localization could be the solution, especially with the tough geopolitics around us. Very finally, in 30 seconds, I can just tell you something here. Yeah, all of these kind of big data systems that sometimes we are missing opportunities for identifying more on what's happening and why there is a great deal of discrepancy of finding the gaps of finance, because there is less dependence on national-based approaches to identifying the gaps of finance. In Egypt, there is a report that was conducted in partnership with all of these organizations to the right. That was conducted a couple of years ago. Next, please. And we had those co-authors of the study, and for the first time, we had an analysis of the integrated national financial framework. And I'm happy to come back to that in questions, but perhaps in the recommendation of the study. Next. That they are just telling us the common sense. In order to deal with the SDGs, you don't need to stop at the 40,000 feet, and you need really to have a more granular approach at the country level. You need to have an integrated national financial framework. You need to invest in human capital, fiscal capital, and resilience and sustainability, with a central role of budget, for the budget to be based on the SDGs. Despite the fact that this study was conducted before the euphoria about the industrial revolution, kind of contribution to artificial intelligence and big data, that was identified earlier. But here is basically the emphasis on investment in at the local level. And we gave an example, and it's a starting point of what's so-called decent life program. So localization is our solution there. Next, please. This could be the last slide. Yes, so this is the same SDGs, but as an Egyptian, I put it in a pyramid. In order to achieve the SDGs, that needs to be within a partnership based on good governance. SDG 16, you need to invest in the economic growth and economic aspects, and you need to do a better job in social and human development. You don't need to forget environment and climate. If you achieve all of that, you will do much better in poverty and inequality than what we are doing today. Thank you so much. And you can see that I lowered my voice because the neighbor in the hotel room that I am living next to had knocked on my wall. So it's still very early. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin. Thank you. Thank you. It's always nice to hear you and to see you intervening in such meetings. Now, we pass on the floor to Excellency Sarah. Sarah is the ex-Minister of Health in Sudan. The floor is yours. 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, ERF, for the organization, and thank you, Dr. Roberta and Dr. Mahmoud, for the informative reflections. and on how the presentations really complemented the scene, especially on reflecting the challenges and further acceleration, and to keep on track on with regard to SDGs and the commitments. Also, what I want to second on is the importance of looking on it as a whole continuum, like what has been reflected in the presentations, that the financing, the human capital resource, and the data systems and the governance cannot be detached or decoupled, and we should be looking onto them as a continuum that should really take us to a positive place. Also, from the presentations, we can see that inequity is a main feature, especially when looking at the slides of the gap between the high-income countries and the low-income countries SDG index. And when we read it, again, it's the under 5 mortality rates and the maternal mortality rates. And also there is within the region a kind of inequity and inequality when we look into the high rates on Yemen, and when we consider also Sudan, where it's even worse. It's the 209 deaths per 100,000 of population. And when we get into looking more on the reasons behind that, which are mostly the preventable deaths, that also brings up the importance of looking onto the social burden and the humane sides of the sustainable development goals, so that we don't just go like rigid, looking into the econometrics data and the epidemiologist figures, but we also need to look beyond that, so that we can really look into the contextualization, which is, the last slides of the localization and the regionalization that has been mentioned by Dr. Mahmoud. Take us onto the importance of the contextualization, and also to look into the opportunities that we have up onto the last grassroots level within the region. Also, one of the important things that these figures shows is the possible structural violence that are there, the structural inequities and inequalities that are there, that we should also be looking at it through multidisciplinary lenses, and also from the social perspective, the anthropological and the sociology perspective as well. When we look into the non-communicable disease per se, the mortality and the probability, they're really high, like what Dr. Roberta mentioned. But when we say as well that the mortalities are high in some rich countries, relatively rich countries, this also brings up that we need to look into two different approaches. The approaches the commitment should be universal, but still the approaches should be more specific, and which also brings up the importance of the country planning and the budgeting for the sustainable development goals, yet using the contextualized lenses. And when we look into the non-communicable diseases as well, here we really need to look into the only 4% that has been mentioned regarding the climate financing for the MENA region, which is really also very concerning, because for the non-communicable diseases, we should not be talking unless we talk comprehensively, looking into the climate, the air pollution, the other policies that should be looking into the food, the shortages, a lot of things. And also the system preparedness and the system abilities to absorb and to provide human resources who can really tackle the NCDs also within its continuum of care. So these are really, really, really challenges that we should be looking into a more radical way. The data and the governance and the accountability, this is also an important keywords to take forward that has came from both presentations. That we can't be accountable, we can't hold anyone accountable unless we use the data. And we look into the data, it has been havoc. We can see even at the country levels, at a lot of, let's say, system strengthening, but system strengthening as standalone. and system strengthening, that you can be having the data, but not the utilization and the tailoring of the service delivery and the let's say the solutions. It should be, we should strengthen the data. We should be sure that we use it and get into evidence-based solutions. And I'm very happy that this question regarding the ERF, how can it work in and be having a real more role, which is, I can see such even panels as a way where we can really bridge the gap between the academia and the services as well. It's either way. Some people, they're at the services, we need to let them be able to ask the questions of why and how, and then they come back and work towards the data. But the most important thing is we shouldn't block at the country levels, not be blocked with having, like, you know, non-strong, let's say, or not well managed or not well captured data. But we should be working with what's available at the program level, and the more we use it, the more we improve it, and the more we go forward into building, like making it like the business as usual is the evidence generation. Also, the most important part is the conflicts. And I would like to highlight how also, let's use the maternal mortality. Yemen, Sudan, the very high in relation to the other countries. And also Syria per se, not having as much or as high, though it's a conflict setting, which might bring up that strong, let's say pre-conflict strong systems might be our way out to absorb and to also craft intervention that would really take us out from there. Also, the conflict-related population forceful movements is also an area that we should get sure that the sustainable, when we talk sustainable development goals, we're lively, let's say, and resilient enough to consider, so that, and we think of it as a population, those who have moved, they lost their assets, of course, but also they lost the social networks and the social support system, which could be somehow, especially when we look at the grassroots, it's a way where you can maneuver and you can find the way out of being just captured through the econometrics or the epidemiological lens of being beyond the poverty line or not. So, and this also again comes the structural violence, and when we move them, being displaced within, let's say, another geographical areas, disrupted in terms of the social network and the social support is also thing that we need to highlight, and we should not move without ensuring that the SDGs really look into that. In a nutshell, I think the two presentations were great on reflecting that we should move beyond the traditional discourses, ensure that the social elements, the systematic theologies that reflects the grassroots, and ensure that the communication is open with the grassroots and the local points is there. Also, strengthening the context-specific governance and accountability is also a thing that we can easily touch it from the two presentations, and of course the multidisciplinary to ensure the human social features. And I'm very happy with the regionalization and the localizations, which is also a kind of, not just, it's an opportunity, of course, but also an advocacy tool and a solidarity point where we can really build on, which is, it reflects how the climate things, which is a real challenge that we will be facing, that we should really be work on since yesterday. And through all that, we will be ensuring that we don't have a dismissive initiative for the poverty and for the poor. Again, the structural analysis for the financing and the landscape, especially where we have seen that within 2 decades, the creditors and the landscape and the architecture hasn't changed enough, and we're having these debt challenges that we should also acclimatized our movement so that we see how can we do that, and how the challenged or the overwhelmed systems with the debt, how is that having its direct spillover into the poor performances towards SDGs. And lastly, the presentations highlighted, and we should second that, it's about the observation. We should keep observing, we should keep analyzing radically and structurally, and we should judge through data, of course, and the governance system and accountability system, so that we hold ourselves accountable. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you. Thank you. Now I call on Dr. Hiba. The floor is yours. Minutes, Dr. Hiba.
How many minutes do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, good.
With a certain elasticity that we we don't
I was
speak
amazed.
loud about.
My first observation is that I was amazed by the extent to which our statistics now, whether with Roberta or with Mahmoud Muhyiddin, magnificent. I can't think of digging for new and fresh information, but rather we're now at a stage to move very fast with this available rich data set that we have on all relevant indicators. I want to say something very brief on women and youth, on the enabling environment for business, and for localization. In terms of the care economy, the stress on women is formidable, and we're very, very lucky at last. And I want to use my experience of the last 12 years in the south of Egypt with the poorest of the poor villages to show what difference one can make on behalf of the women working on the ground. We have literally transformed the status of women in one governorate, which is the first and main one where I work out of 5, which is Qina. We work in half of the 165 villages that account for 3.5 million population. And what we were able to do on behalf of women within the village, the respect, the support for their work, the extent to which we are able to use the richest available resource are NGOs. And this is something that works across the Arab world. Can you imagine? It was the second poorest village governorate out of Egypt's 27 governorate, Qina, just above Luxor. We have 154 villages, the total. I work in half of them, the poorest, and that's because we have, again, a fantastic poverty map. The availability of data was such that we also have this fantastical treasure that's unutilized, NGOs. Would you believe that in the second poorest governorate, half the population is under the poverty line, half of the 3.5 million. We have 1,600 NGOs on the ground, all local. Many don't even have a structure. They work out of their home. But this is what we've used from day one, because we want our impact to remain with them when we leave. The second thing that has made a huge difference is to work on bringing business. We didn't have a single ready-made garments factory in Qina. I've had to build the first 2 just to showcase what it is like to bring women and train them and have them work. It's youth and women, so it's also young men who are taking advantage of our interventions. We were able to raise and spend $17 million in 12 years. We're now in the 13th. And as I said, we're in 74 villages. The training of the youth has been extremely important. Access to finance, small management of small enterprises, social services, including health and education, have been very important, especially literacy for the mothers and preschools for their children. So my call is that we should all, whatever developing country we're looking at, is to look for how to localize, okay? And that's my last intervention. Why and how? When we say localization of the SDGs, what we mean is to really bring all of the SDGs, the 17 interventions, and that's what we've tried to do. So we had to be interdisciplinary. We have 3 of us. I'm an industrial economist, manufacturing, agriculture, a former head of the FAO, and a social scientist on the education and health. So this, I would say, is how we made it. We made it to be able to move, to change the lives of those who need us, and to place women in the hierarchy. It's just amazing how women can take on roles when they were, for very long, I have to admit, in Egypt, we have dreadful, the wife of the husband, sorry, the mother of the husband. Very, very tough to deal with when you're a young bride. And we've managed to separate by providing possibilities also for the hama the mother-in-law. Yes, we have a problem in Egypt. I don't know about other countries. The environment, of course, has been the main work and intervention of agriculture. And we were able to make a difference on sugar plantations. They're all in the south, in Qina and Sohag and Luxor. Sugar cane, sericulture, we've brought it back. Honey, molasses, you name it, anything that improves on the animal stock, etc. The manufacturing was, of course, the most difficult because it's the most expensive. We didn't want to have the type of Bangladesh, borrowing. We wanted to move immediately into the formal. All of our women are working. I'm talking of all women. We have upwards of 100,000 working. And it's all formal jobs, so that we make this jump from not knowing how to sew at all to having a full-time job, 6 hours a day, not more, in the garment industry, which is no business person accepts, but we do. And we're going to make money and export very soon to Turkey. On behalf of Turkey, as I was mentioning in one of the meetings yesterday, Turkey has become much richer, and the garment industry is being neglected. And we're very close, Egypt and Turkey. So we've started a relationship whereby we're going to produce what they want because they have export markets. So you can see ERF has brought about many opportunities, in fact, over the past 30 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hiba. Very insightful, that experience. Very insightful. Thank you very much. Last but not least, commentator, Dr. Tuhami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President. I am happy to be with you. I would like to thank the ERF, Dr. Ibrahim and Shireen, to put me in this panel. I found myself in this panel, really, because I was not informed before. I think I have less things to share with you after the presentation of Dr. Roberta and Muhyiddin, because it was a very important and very insight proposition. And from academic point of view, I asked myself what I can add. I just to project the situation on the Moroccan case. That's only what I can add after the presentation of international institutions. So it's clear that to combat the poverty is the responsibility of government. It's clear to achieve the SDGs is the responsibility of government. And there is many policy to put for that targets. So program, and in Morocco at least there is a program to reform the social security systems. This is what we have in the agenda in the Moroccan situation. It's in parallel with the SDGs program, and what we put all the program in one large program is the reform de la protection sociale, so the system, the reform of the social protection system. But it's clear the program is become complex when we put it in an intergenerational point of view, in a temporal point of view, because this program, this reform needs to be financed, need finance. And I think the proposition of Dr. Muhyiddin in the last part phase on that, because we can achieve some objectives for the generation now, but the debt can be more and more in next year. And we have a crowding or a trade-off between next social expenditure and the debt services. So in my point of view, we have to put all this problematic in a new framework, in a new integrated framework, taking in consideration the objectives, the short-term objectives, but also the long-term objectives, looking for the deficit, for the debt, and for other consideration, intergenerational consideration. It's clear in macroeconomic concept we have some equivalence Ricardian equivalences between what we can, the expenditure now and the debt now. I think some countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, we are looking for that. So it's clear we have to improve and to target the objective of the SDGs, but the government must take in account the deficit and the debt to be sure 10 years after we have some fiscal space to cover other expenditure in this side. I think in academic framework, but also for the policymaker, we have to look this situation, this objective in integrated framework to look the objectives now, but also the long-term perspective. I have only this point. I think we have now a fresh data from international story, from national framework. We need access to that data as academic, clear. But I think the problem is here, and we can, from the academic point of view, to help and to give a look on this complex problem. Thank you, President. This is only the point I have.
Thank you. Our presentators and commenters have taken much of the time. Their presentations and their interventions are so interesting to the stage where we couldn't stop them. But they have eaten some of the time of the floor. But this Doctor.
Yeah, the comments are open now, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Doctor, for the opportunity to say to respond. I just wanted to actually really start by I don't know how to put it, but really to appreciate the role that Professor Hiba Handousa is playing in the second poorest, governorate in Egypt. And I think Hiba is somebody who has had been in the center of power in terms of not in the government, but in terms of the professional elites in Cairo. The founding managing director of the Economic Research Forum, and several other roles that she played. I think the fact that she decided to actually come down to the ground and be in the trenches, working with the people who are the real target of...
So you know this revolution is not over. We were told yesterday it may be over. It isn't.
Okay. I just wanted to highlight that, to underscore that is an inspiration for all of us. And it reminded me of a long time ago, a very distinguished economist, Pranab Bardhan. He gave a talk in Nairobi about sub-Saharan Africa and development and so on. And he advised the researchers and the economists there to go to the villages. Because he said that even though he's a professor at Berkeley economic department and so on, that he really learned economics during the summers when he used to go to Calcutta and speak to the tailors and the vendors and what have you. And he said that is when I really understood better economics than the lecture theaters in California. So I really think this is a very interesting experience, and I hope that we all take lessons from it. I don't want to embarrass you, Hiba, but I thought I should just share my views on what you are doing. Lastly, very quickly, I think the issue of conflict is really very important. Roberta and her team, they produced a recent report on conflict and debt. And I think the impact of conflict in our region is particularly devastating. Major countries like Syria, even to some extent Iraq, but also, of course, Yemen and Sudan and Libya, they are impacted by major conflicts. And it's not only affecting the countries in question and the people, but also exerting negative externality on the neighboring countries. And I think this should be an area of research and focus for us going forward, even from the perspective of SDGs, for example. Thank you.
Thank you so much for very interesting presentations. I have a question for Roberta. How do you explain the improvement in different social outcomes like health or education in the region, despite the fact that two things. First, most of the reforms that have been implemented in the region have been more centered around stabilization policies, not really structural reforms on the one hand, and on the other, that social spending in general in most of the countries, and especially I will take the example of Egypt, has been linearly decreasing over time, given the increase in interest payments and investment in infrastructure, for instance. So how this distortion in the social contract can be consistent with the improvement in some social outcomes. Thank you so much.
Well, let me just say what an honor it was to participate to this panel, because I learned so much from all of you and Dr. Mahmoud's presentation. Let me try to address this question, which is very interesting. So a couple of thoughts. You saw some improvements on the sort of, on a number of indicators of health. This is true worldwide, as it is true for MENA. Let me put forth a couple of hypotheses. What we see is worldwide an improvement in health, but a much slower improvement in education. And in both cases, we see very weak correlation between spending in those sectors and outcomes. So what is happening? I don't think that there is a silver bullet answer, but something that I can say is that the innovation in the health sector has had a diffusion that was relatively easier than the diffusion of knowledge that you need in the education sector to be able to make things better. Think about the sort of rehydration pill, which has really saved lives much faster than you could teach an extra teacher to be a better, you could train an extra teacher to be a better teacher. So in that sense, there's been a transition from the sort of communicable diseases type prevalence to non-communicable diseases. And this is something that I think that what Dr. Sarah said was a reminder to me, particularly thinking about Sudan. I was focusing on the MENA region per se, that there are still pockets of communicable diseases that we also saw flaring up during conflict. So that transition is by no means complete, but that type of diffusion of innovation was very helpful to sort of improve a number of outcomes. Same for sort of prenatal attendance and birth attendance. There seems to be a clear correlation between prenatal care, birth having a sort of specialized nurse or person who's attending to the birth, and good health outcomes for both the mother and the child. So let me conclude on something that is connected to your question and that Dr. Mahmoud put forth very importantly. At the moment, you were talking about sort of declining social spending. And although the correlation is weak with outcomes, spending is a necessary condition, yet not sufficient, but is necessary for these good outcomes to happen. Dr. Mahmoud put up a very important slide, which was about how the debt service is eating up into essential spending. And if I think about our region, and particularly Egypt, which is a country of dramatic challenges, but also incredible potential, 8% of GDP is spent on debt service right now. And that's half of the revenue that Egypt collects. Dr. Mahmoud was saying, good luck if you're thinking about domestic revenue mobilization for a whole set of spending. And I think he was particularly thinking about climate change and green transition related issues. But I'm thinking about social spending at the moment. And there is a crowding out happening. And although not sufficient, that spending is necessary, particularly if it is focused on soft aspects related to accountable and well-trained professionals. So I don't know that I completely answered your question, but I hope I touched upon some points of reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. Before passing the floor to Mirza, I'll pass on the floor to Mahmoud Muhyiddin. Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much, and many thanks to the discussants for their very useful comments. Let me just react to what they mentioned. I'm happy with their emphasis on few things: the need for political economy to be considered, including granularity at the country level, and the consideration for fragile and conflict and post-conflict situations, as reflected by Her Excellency Dr. Sarah. And then she mentioned as well governance, and in a previous study that I encourage you all to have a look at, because the bulk of funding is for SDGs, even for the social infrastructure, will have an important infrastructure component. But the governance is important in itself. But if we consider the efficiency loss and the cost of doing business in infrastructure based on a recent study in public investment in infrastructure by Schwartz and his colleagues. I encourage you all to have a look at it. If you are in an advanced or high income economy in our region, the likelihood of a loss is around 15%. If you are in a middle income country of our region, the cost of bad governance is 34%. And we're not talking corruption here. We're talking just issues related to governance at large. If you are in a low income country, the likelihood of loss is around 50%. So consideration of governance as important as being part of SDGs, SDG 16, importance for transparency, accountability, and monitoring. But even if you are taking the very narrow focus on efficiency, there are implications on that. I like very much what Dr. Heba mentioned. I'd like to refer to another study that I did with my colleague, Dr. Susanna Nassah, on localization, SDGs, and digitalization. What she is doing in Qina is a good example to be replicated in other countries, and I'm very aware of what she has been doing for years, and it's reminding me of the exceptional work that another guru of economics and planning by the name of Dr. Ibrahim Hilmi Abdul Rahman has been doing in my neighborhood near my village. That's now a city in Kafr Shukr. That is based, when you are doing that, issues related to contributions of women and youth could be more visible. Matters related to the business environment at the local level could be realized. And I would really advise for good consideration of being practical that decentralization may not really be a solution. It's localization that could realize the benefits on comparative advantage of the center and the peripheries at the same time. The very final point benefiting from having you chair, ESCWA made an estimate for some of our countries when it comes to the cost of doing the SDGs. In the case of Egypt, the average for 10 years from 2020 to 2030 was $76 billion as a gap. This is more than 19% of our GDP. This is much higher, by the way, than a very important study just released from the IMF about climate risks in costing the SDGs, which is two things, please. First, perhaps to host those who are working on finance for development. Mr. Lee at the beginning reminded us of an important conference taking place for the first time since 2015 in Madrid next year. We need our region and our countries to be adequately prepared. And perhaps we need to have a joint piece on the ERF countries or the Arab countries or the countries in MENA region to have an assessment, update on the study that we did for Egypt, but extending the work on ESCWA, and that could be a useful contribution. Otherwise, we'll be victims of these 30,000 feet, 40,000 feet studies that are not really capturing the national level and the local level adequately. And that could really be a good contribution to decision makers, investors, but we need to start yesterday because, as I said, the conference is in June. Having said that, very grateful to the opportunity, and I wish that I would have brought better assessment of the situation in the SDGs, but I think of what Roberta mentioned, and I complemented that from some global and national local level, is telling our policymakers that we need to do much better in the remaining years than what we have done during the last 10 years to achieve at least decent part of the Sustainable Development Goals before the finish line. Thank you.
Thank you. Before wrapping up, we'll pass on the floor to Dr. Mirza.
Thank you. Thank you.
We are squeezed by time.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for our panelists. And yes, I totally agree that, the SDG, this is something happened, after 2015. It's the best things happen, to really elevate people from many things. Due to the pandemic and the conflict, many countries, they lost decades of development. Fiscal space is shrinking. Today, if you look at the satellite picture of Syria, the infrastructure existing now is equivalent to 1952. So we lost 70 years of development. So this region needs peace, And that's where we need urgently to push for that. But what is my concern? My concern is about, that we are losing the line of sight when it comes to the SDG at the expenses of the climate. The multilateral institutions now and the others are focusing more on the climate, pushing more financing for the climate at the expenses of the SDGs. We just remind them that don't forget about the SDGs. Always we are saying that, but still, this file is not finished. Let's finish it before we will enter to another file. That's my issue. We start a good files, we're not finishing it, we enter into another one, and still, we have an issue with the first one. So I think what my urge here, to really focus on the SDG, we have only 6 years to go. Let's try to do as much as we can rather than to go now to put most of our resources and financing and private capital mobilization into climate.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mirza. I'll pass on the floor to Roberta for 1 minute.
Thank you. And I think that Dr. Mirza puts a very important point out there. Somehow, the answer that I can give is that our dream is a world free of poverty on a livable planet. But the free of poverty is not gone. And the attention to human capital, the attention to helping countries chart a path towards unleashing productivity, which is also essential to make the best of human capital, is definitely very present on our minds. The word with which I wanted to conclude was not only thank you for allowing me to be here, but particularly thank you to Dr. Heba for the inspiration that she gave us in making sense of how all of these numbers that sometimes can look lofty or kind of like just very theoretical come to make sense when there is concerted effort, there is purposeful dedication, and there is a mind behind that really brings together what is needed and makes a difference on the ground. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. We have to wrap up. We are really far behind the time. Mahmoud raised the hand. Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, you raised the hand?
Yes, I raised the hand for 2 reasons. Again, everything that Roberta mentioned, especially about commending the exceptional work of Professor Heba Handousa for great history of contribution to the academic community. And now she's practicing what she has been preaching for many decades. I commend her work, and that needs to be supported and replicated in other governments. The second part, I will have an opportunity with my good friend, Dr. Mirza Hassan. He's hosting us in Kuwait in a couple of weeks. And there is a discussion that we need to take seriously on matters related to climate finance, which, if carefully designed, climate finance should be development finance. Climate action should be development action. So it's all about design of policies. Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda and the work on COP28 had spelled out opportunities, not just in decarbonization, but in investments in human capital, in water management, in agriculture and food system. So for that, we can get climate closer to development. That agenda had been hijacked, and we need really to bring it back to development by integrating it. At the end of the day, climate action is SDG 13. It's one of the 17, not a different one. But more discussion on that will be, inshallah, soon in Kuwait. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.